All right, welcome back to solving proportions. We're going to talk about a third relationship that always exists between the ratios in a proportion, and you can use it to solve. So to do this, let's actually look back at that first page. And for a second, you may have noticed in the last question on this page one more pattern, not just the within and between. So the pattern is this: if you multiply across from top to bottom, something interesting happens. You get the same thing. This is called the cross product relationship. When we multiply from top to bottom across the equals sign, we're going to get the same thing. It works no matter which of the rates you choose. For example, 5 times 50 is 250, and 25 times 10 is also 250. If a proportion is a true proportion, the cross products will always be equal. So on this page, what we're trying to do is determine whether the rates in this table are actually equal. So let's do this by first setting up a proportion. I'm going to set up a proportion with some labels here. This is talking about miles and hours, and I'm going to write it in proportion form. So 300 miles is in 6 hours. And I'm wondering, is that the same thing as 325 miles in 6.5 hours? It's hard for me to tell using the within or the between ratios, so that's where I'm going to use the cross product relationship. I'm going to multiply 6 times 325, and then I'm going to multiply 300 times 6.5. Let's see what we get. 325 times 6 is 1,950, and 300 times 6.5 is also 1,950. So they're true. It is a true proportion. Let's look at the next one. Again, we're talking about whether these two things are equal. And to do that, I'm going to write it in proportion form. Dollars and pounds, those are my labels. And I'm wondering, is $8.5 for 4 pounds the same rate as 10.5 for $10.50 for 6 pounds? And to do that, we need to first cross multiply. So 4 times 10.5. Let me show my work over on this side. 4 times 10.5. And then 8.5 times 6. I'm wondering if those are the same thing. Well, 4 times 10.5, that's 42. And already I can tell 8.5 times 6 is going to be way more. It's 51. So these are not equal. And that tells you that these two rates are not equivalent. It's a different rate, different cost per pound. Okay, so what I want you to do is take a few minutes to write each of these sets of ratios in proportion form. Then use the cross product relationship to see if they're equal. When you're finished, so pause the video now, and then when you're finished, check with the control. Okay, you ready? So you should have determined that only number 4 has equivalent ratios. Because only in number 4 are the cross products equal. And you also should have seen something, especially when you looked at number 5, like this is not a reasonable relationship. 4 is much smaller than 9, but 12 is larger than 3. It just wouldn't make sense for that to be true. So if you saw that, nice job. Okay, and then number 6, he is wrong. 430 is not equal to 440. Those two rates are not the same thing. The cross product relationship tells us this. Okay, now this is all useful because sometimes we need to solve proportions where it's not convenient to write an in-between or within ratio like you did in the last video. So let's see an example of this. Sarah uses 3/4 pounds of blueberries to make 2/3 cups of jam. how many pounds of blueberries does she need to make each cup of jam? And I'm going to remember when I'm talking about each cup, I'm not talking about one, so per one of something. Okay, the first thing I need to do is write a proportion with labels. And so in this case, our proportion is going to be about blueberries and cups of jam. And we know that 3/4 pounds makes 2/3 cups. And I'm trying to find how many pounds will I need for 1 cup. Now maybe you see another way to solve this, but if you don't, you can use the cross product relationship. Here are the steps. First, cross multiply. Cross multiply. And to do that cross multiplication, so 2/3 times x, I'm just going to write that as 2/3 x because I can't do anything further with that. 3/4 times 1, well, that's just 3/4. Okay, the next step is to write an equation. That equation shows us that these two things are equal. Finally, I need to solve that equation, and if I have a multiplication equation, that means I'm going to need to divide to solve the equation. Okay, so draw a line through the equal sign, or under the equal, and we need to divide by 2/3 on both sides. But I want you to realize that if we are dividing by 2/3, that's the same thing as multiplying by 3/2. Remember, keep, change, and flip. Dividing by a number is the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal. So really what I need to do is I need to multiply both sides by 3/2. I'm doing division, but with fractions, dividing fractions, we multiply by the reciprocal. So now when I simplify, this is just going to be 1x. And over here, we're going to have 9/8, which is equal to 1 1/8. So that means she's going to need 1 1/8 pounds of blueberries. Okay, let's do one more together. A novelist can write 2.25 pages in 1.5 hours. Determine how many pages she can write in 2 hours. So pages is our x. First, let's write a proportion. I'm talking about pages per hour, and 2.25 pages can be written in 1.5 hours. And I want to know how many pages can she write in 2 hours. And this is where the labels are sometimes helpful, because how many pages I need to put up on the top, because that's where the pages are. And the hours go on the bottom, because that's where the hours are. Okay, now I'm going to go back to my steps. The first step up here is to cross multiply. So that means I'm doing 1.5 times x, that's 1.5x. And 2.25 times 2, I'm going to do that over to the side. 2.25 times 2, this is my side work section. Is 4.5. The next step is to write an equation. These two things are equal. And now I'm going to solve the equation using division. Dividing by 1.5. Now I'm going to do the work correctly over to the side in a second, but sometimes people solve this equation and they might get 30, which is not correct. When you get a number for your solution, you should always look back and say, is that answer reasonable? Would 30 pages written in 2 hours be reasonable here? Absolutely not. If the novelist can only write 2.25 pages in an hour and a half, just a little more time, another half hour, is not going to write almost 28 pages for her. It just doesn't make sense. Similarly, if you got 0.3, that would not make sense, because that's fewer pages than she wrote in the first place. So Let's go ahead and do that division over to the side real quick. Make sure we don't make a mistake like that. We've got to move the decimal outside, which means we move it inside. 15 goes into 45 3 times. And that's why the decimal place is right there. So it's 3, not 30 or 0.3. So she can write 3 pages in 2 hours.